Hi, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us back here in room two on the policy track. I'm Andrew Bradley, Policy Director for Prosperity Indiana. And I'm glad to have you here. Welcome you to the session from Vacancy and Blight to the Affordability Crisis, Housing Policy Solutions Across the Spectrum. Really happy to be joined by Tarek Abdelazim, who is Director of National Technical Assistance at the Center for Community Progress. Tarek and I have actually been working pretty closely together over the past 8 months or so on land bank issues. And I imagine that's going to surface a little bit in his discussion. But I'm going to leave the rest of the introduction of the topic to Tarek. But a couple of house cleaning items before we set up here. We are going to share the slides and the video later. Do want to encourage you, you can use the chat function individually or within this room. But if you have specific questions for Tarek, use the Q&A button over on the right. And there will be time, especially towards the end, to be able to address some of those questions. But that would be helpful if you put those in as we go so he knows which ones to address. So without any further ado, Tarek, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I know you are all at the end of a very long day, so I figured I'm going to try to make this as provocative as possible to keep people re-engaged, but I hope you had the opportunity to grab coffee in that last interim, so maybe that will keep us all a bit recharged. As Andrew said, I with the Center for Community Progress. Just a little bit about me. I've been working with the center for about 8 years now, and prior to joining, I had served 8 years at City Hall in Binghamton, New York, serving both as deputy mayor for 4 years and then 4 years as director of planning, housing, and community development. Certainly cut my teeth on vacancy and abandonment in a city. I was home to IBM, but like so many other Rust Belt legacy cities, after experiencing a departure of manufacturing and jobs in the 80s, just extreme challenges. So my heart is certainly in this with all of those who are doing the good work, working to build equitable, healthy communities. And why don't we just jump right into it? So I believe, Andrew, you have my slideshow. I was having some difficulties, so hopefully we can pull that up. And again, I would love this to be as interactive as possible. So if folks have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and add them in the Q&A. And if you want to politely push back on anything I say, feel free to do that in the chat. Okay, I'm going to see if I can pop that a little wider. That was a little too wide. Okay, why don't we jump to the next screen? So very quickly, Center for Community Progress, we are a national nonprofit, and we are the leader helping communities address vacant and abandoned deteriorated properties. We do this work with strong focus on racial equity, injustice, and obviously what you've heard today in some of the presentations and what I'll touch on, there's very good reason for us to center that in our work. We do this through technical assistance. We have educational programming. We work on policy and research, both at the local, state, and federal level. We really focus on systems level changes. We've been doing this since 2010, have pretty much served in almost every state except a few, and working in communities, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, from the Houstons, the Miamis, to the coal mining towns in West Virginia, to the Rust Belt cities all across the Great Lakes regions and even out west. So why don't we jump to the next slide? I have to give a little plug, of course. We have our national conference that brings together all of the incredible folks working in this space and community development with a focus on vacancy and abandonment and housing justice issues. It will be in Chicago this year after we've had pretty much a 2.5-year hiatus. So it is really an amazing opportunity, very practitioner focused, and we bring and showcase great models all over the country that folks can learn from. We also host a series of programmings, whether it's scholarships, and that's exactly what we've been working with at Prosperity in Indiana and a whole statewide coalition of partners in Indiana on some land banking work. But then we also offer a lot of opportunities for community residents and nonprofit leaders to kind of get the same kind of support and technical assistance that we provide to a lot of decisions. Next slide. All right, so this is where we have some animation. So go ahead and click one. So I like either ending or starting at some point with this slide. And what I'd like to share with folks is to really think about the challenges that you're facing in your community. Somebody who has been traveling this country for the last 8 years, and again, visiting such a geographic, diverse range of communities, I can tell you that there are very four common crises. Iterations vary across the regions, but they really do distill down to four issues. One is we still have highly segregated communities, both by race and by class. And that is obviously a legacy of unjust policies over decades, but it's a really hard challenge to unwind. Second button. Andrew, if you can go ahead and click the next one. We also have a really serious problem with systemic poverty. And we've seen this actually worsening in many communities across the country. We also know that this wealth gap is racialized. And so this is becoming more and more entrenched and a real challenge that presents itself in so many different ways, particularly as we're looking at equitable development. Housing issues. There is a housing crisis of some form in every community. Again, whether it's San Francisco, Portland, Austin's, or Miami's that are dealing with extreme housing affordability challenges, to some of the rural and small cities, Rust Belts that are dealing with quality, affordable housing for all residents. There is no question that every single community we speak with, housing is either first or second issue, and it is endemic across this country. And then the last button we have here, the common challenge that many communities are facing is really climate change, natural disasters, how this is going to impact our communities, often disproportionately impacting low-income and communities of color. This is going to really dramatically reshape our communities in ways that we can't even imagine at this moment. Now, one last click. So what is a common factor that links these four crises? I'd say there's quite a few, but one of them that is underlying all of them is just land. Land, who owns it? Who controls it? Land is wealth, land is power. It has always been that case since the origins of this country, and it continues to be the case. So it's a really interesting and challenging complex when we think about how are we going to unwind segregation? How are we going to achieve more equitable and inclusive communities? How are we going to build resilient communities when land is also a commodity? It's an asset class, right? And that really presents a problem. And I want to be provocative and say the free market alone not only doesn't solve these problems, but quite often it will exacerbate them. I'm sure some of you are saying, I can't believe Prosperity Indiana invited a communist to present, but I'm not. I would ask very simply, any of you, I'm presenting you a property in Gary, Indiana, that is available for $5,000. And all you have to do has beautiful bones, just invest $100,000 into it and it's yours. And I think many of you would say, no, thank you. You are making a rational decision that will not bear out your investment. And so you choose not to. At the same time, I would say that if you were in a community, maybe a particular neighborhood in Indianapolis and starting to feel a lot of pressures from market, maybe there's a large catalytic project or anchor institution is expanding, and you're starting to see those real estate prices go up. And suddenly you have the opportunity to raise your rent 30, 40, 50%. You're going to have to displace the current folks that were living there. Imagine if a local official came to you and said, you know what, can you do the upgrades you were planning, but continue to rent at that low rate? Again, every single one of you would say, no, thank you. Maybe provide me an incentive, lower my taxes, but alone, free market, I am not going to make that decision. So I say that for us to really, we have to normalize that conversation. that land is an incredible asset in our community that will help us get to equity, resiliency, and inclusion. At the same time, it is treated as a commodity that often doesn't care about any of those outcomes. And that's a tension that presents the opportunity for the government to come in many different ways. And whether we're in at the strongest market spectrum or we're in the weakest market spectrum, government is going to have to take an approach if it seeks to really move forward with equitable, inclusive, and resilient long-term vision. So why don't we jump to the next slide? Now, if we're talking about land, if we're talking about how we hope to achieve those long-term goals, I think it's really important to understand a little bit of the history. You've heard this today, so I'm not going to belabor it, but there's no question that it's not just individual choices that we make that shape markets and neighborhoods. It is biases, policies, and there's no question that race, racism, and discrimination have played a large role in shaping our neighborhoods and our communities writ large. Next screen. Just a few of the examples. Obviously, I saw the presentation, so some of you, I hope, had seen it or heard of this before, redlining and its impact in communities. That bottom picture on the left is Monkey Bottom in Winston-Salem, a very robust and vibrant Black neighborhood that was entirely decimated by urban renewal. It wasn't just a transportation initiative. We know that there are many communities that were white-only communities. And then if you can hit the button one more time, Andrew, on the far right, what you saw is a race-based restrictive covenant. I think many of you are aware of these. Basically, this was also emerged because the Federal Housing Administration, it was federal policy that in order to finance or ensure many of these large redevelopment subdivision projects, that the owners had to put a race-based restrictive covenant on all of the homes. And if you can read that, it says the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons. They were very inclusive here, of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, and they misspelled it, or African blood or descent. This isn't a poster that was designed by an artist. This is actually a real race-based restrictive covenant that was very popular in the 40s, 50s, until it was ruled basically illegal. But thousands and thousands and thousands of homes built with this restriction. So why don't we go to the next slide? The interesting thing is that we know that this unjust and racist legacy still persists. These are three maps of different metrics pulled from the Lake County region, and you can see there's a really strong correspondence between the percent of non-white population, the percent of population in poverty, and the residential vacancy rate. These overlays are not by accident, but again, they are the artifacts of an unjust, decades of unjust and racist policy that shaped our spaces, our places, our neighborhoods, and our communities. Next screen. I wanted to include just a couple others. There's an incredible project out of Minneapolis called Mapping Prejudice, and they actually went through thousands and thousands of the clerks and recorder of deeds files, and they started to map all of those places that actually had race-based restrictive covenants. And you can see it's all around Minneapolis. So this really reflects the suburbanization of communities, white flight, and making sure that there were basically barriers set up for certain people not to be able to enjoy the opportunity that presented itself through these housing choices. And on the right, Andrew, if you can hit it one more time, I think this is just an incredible example of, again, how that legacy persists. This is the city of Albany, New York. It is its red line map from the 1930s. And you can see those red lined neighborhoods. Those were the ones where there was the presence of, as they described in the Holt maps, Negroes, immigrants, Poles, Slavics, any one that they deemed a financial risk to mortgages were basically redlined and denied the opportunity to access financial products. And it's hard to see, but there are many dots all over those neighborhoods. Those are the properties held by the Albany County Land Bank as of 2018. In other words, all of the vacant and abandoned and tax foreclosed properties that went through the foreclosure process and ended up in the land bank, the place that they were supposed to try to triage all of the wreckage of weak markets and vacancy and abandonment. It's just incredible the correspondence to those neighborhoods. There is very few properties in their inventory that are outside of those two red line neighborhoods. Next screen. And one more. So I know this is pretty basic, but I do think it's important to talk about what do we mean when we talk about the market. Obviously, at a regional level, it's important to look more at economic activity, jobs, migration patterns. There's the city, but I want to look at the neighborhood market. The market exists at so many levels, but as we're talking about these housing policy solutions, particularly weak markets and strong markets, and thinking about equity, inclusion, and resiliency, this is about the right scale. And it really is the sum of choices that people make about investing their money and personal well-being in a neighborhood. I want to call out that investors and tenants definitely different than homeowners, because homeowners are investing more than just their finances. They're investing their soul, their spirit, their character, basically their beliefs. So the choices that they make are certainly have much greater resonance, and can often play a large role in shaping neighborhood markets. Next screen. So I kind of touched on this when I joked about, offering you two opportunities in Gary and Indianapolis. These are the questions and the choices that all these individual actors will make. Will this house be worth more or less 5 years from now? Is it next to a successful school? Are there park amenities? Are there grocery stores? So now it's not just the product of the house itself, but it's the neighborhood and the amenities. On the far right, if I rehab this, will it then be worth more than it cost me to buy it and fix it up? So let's say I am a contractor. I do like to do fix ups, but in so many neighborhoods and challenges, the market won't bear what the person put in and paid for with a profit. So again, choices are either stalled or pursued because of these conditions. And then same thing with the bottom. It's about renting. Will it pay for the costs? Why don't we jump to the next one? I think you have an idea, but the choices that we make are also exacerbated by our biases. And then, as we've seen historically, government policy. This is the most basic lesson that we all know when it comes to economic supply and demand. And when we look at some of the cities that face probably the greatest level of systemic vacancy, you can see that they lost population 30, 40, 50% from 1970 to 2010. We know those causes massive changes in our economy, white flight, suburbanization, sprawl, loss of manufacturing hubs. But clearly now we have a massive oversupply, and we're see properties go into obsolescence. We're going to see abandoned, and that is really going to have an impact on the neighborhood market. At the same time, on the right side, you can see even those neighborhoods that might have some decent properties. The question is that the product that many current homeowners or renters or investors are looking for today? There's so many properties in many of our communities that just have one bathroom, or that 900 square feet with one bathroom, and that just doesn't match the preferences of today's consumer. Next slide. So clearly we have strong markets, we have weak markets. We're going to talk about those, but most cities have mixed markets. I don't want to pick on Gary because I've worked with him in the past, and some of the scrappiest folks that I've ever met doing incredible work. But they have some of the most systemic challenges of vacancy and abandonment in Indiana in the country. There's very little activity for neighborhoods that have strong market to build off. Great assets, great folks, but those underlying market challenges are very real and pervasive. place like Indianapolis or so, Fort Wayne, they do have mixed markets where you have maybe the downtown is starting to boom. Maybe the adjacent neighborhood to downtown is still experiencing high levels of poverty and vacancy. That's very common in many cities. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because no matter where you are in strong markets or in weak markets, I personally believe that the goal should be the same. How do we cultivate and support responsible property ownership? How do we protect neighborhoods and neighbors from irresponsible owners? And then some particular protections around vulnerable tenants, some particular protections around vulnerable homeowners, particularly as those markets shift. If you hit the button once, I think all of that sums up into what I call housing justice. Andrew, if you can forward, there's one more animation here. And that is, yes, we do work primarily in communities that are facing vacant and abandoned properties. We've also been working in some of those really hot markets, trying to think about how we can create some of that public inventory for a public good. But no matter where you are, I consider the work that we do part of housing justice. How can we ensure that every resident has access to healthy, safe, affordable housing? I'm not talking gorgeous granite countertops and 2,000 square footage units, but I'm just talking basic health, safety standards and affordable. So these folks ain't experiencing extreme burden and that they're not facing housing insecurity. So next slide. So if those are some of our goals, of course, I just think it's important as we think about strong markets and weak markets, there is a huge, huge chorus always about gentrification. And those concerns are real. They can come from a space and a history of trauma. But what's interesting is that both research that'll show here from 2014 and subsequent research done by our senior fellow, Alan Malik, and many others show that the census tracts and the neighborhoods that are gentrifying are very few compared to the census tracts in the neighborhoods that are either stuck, in decline, or in absolute complete free fall. So we're going to have to hit through a few buttons here, Andrew. So this study tracked persistence of poverty over the last 40 years in the 51 largest metropolitan areas. Go ahead. And back in 1970, there were about 1,100 high poverty census tracts. That means residents within that tract where more than 30% were impoverished. And if you can click it one more time. So they looked, what was the progress of those census tracts? Well, over 40 years, there were only about 100 of them that had poverty rates that had fallen below that national average. Right, so only 100 of about 1,100 had actually seen, an increase in vibrancy and vitality. Next. Meanwhile, the number of high poverty census tracts within those 51 metropolitan areas almost tripled. One more, and the total population living in high poverty census tracts had more than doubled. I mean, what we're seeing is kind of those soft boundaries of places segregated by class and race. They're becoming more rigid. The opportunity to move from one to the others is becoming steeper and harder. And this is just, again, real challenges, particularly as we're seeking equity, inclusion, resilience, and yet still land is so vulnerable to the whims of the market as a commodity. Next slide. When we work with weak markets, and I'm sure you all can see this cycle, it's not that surprising. When you have weak demand, it starts to trigger a whole series of negative harms. And those only compound the weakness and the challenge in those markets, basically creating a vicious cycle. Whether it's mortgage delinquencies, tax delinquencies, where we start to see an increase in speculative buying. We start to see deferred maintenance because of lack of financial resources, or intentional deferred maintenance for folks that just want to get out. And then we see more absentee ownerships. We lose those homeowners, those resident, those legacy anchors. We see more properties in deterioration, just completely abandoned. And again, that's furthering and furthering that cycle and weakening the demand, making all of you less and less likely to ever invest your personal resources in that neighborhood. Next slide. So what are some of the key solutions and the policy solutions to tackle that? Well, one I want to say is that this can be an intractable challenge, right? A seemingly intractable challenge. But I do think it's very important to be honest about what's possible. Most of the work that we do with communities is to help them with policy solutions that will set the stage for long-term, right, vitality. But most of it is to minimize the harm right now and in that short term. Minimize the harms to people, to the neighbors and the neighborhoods. And the two key systems that really play a large role in these some of the weakest markets is obviously delinquent property tax enforcement system and housing building code enforcement system. This makes sense because the two greatest responsibilities of a property owner when it comes to that social contract and the common good is to keep up with repairs and to keep up with your taxes, right? So it's these two systems that are triggered when an owner starts to slip or fail. But we're very clear when we work with communities that yes, we want to build efficient and effective systems. When that property clearly is vacant and abandoned and there's an irresponsible and negligent owner, let's try to remove the harm as quickly as possible and get that under responsible ownership. But these systems also need to be equitable. And that's the most important part. We know that many people can experience financial hardship because the loss of job, certainly COVID the last couple of years has really altered folks' household finances and securities, whether there's a health crisis in the family. So just because someone slips in their repairs or their taxes doesn't mean they're negligent, doesn't mean they're approaching the neighborhood with malfeasance and we need to take care of them and get them out. These systems need equitable off ramps. And we need to be very conscious of that, particularly in the weakest markets, because these systems, if too efficient and too effective, can actually cause more harm in these weak housing markets. Ultimately, the goal is compliance. But obviously, when we're dealing with systemic poverty, when we're dealing with a lot of the kind of the cyclone of social economic challenges that really can present some trauma, both to neighborhood writ large and neighbors, compliance is not always easy. So I want to jump to the next slide if you can, or just hit the button. Where we can't get compliance, where we've created equitable off ramps, and there still is, this property is still second year, third year delinquent, is constantly requiring code to go and mow the lawn or pick up trash and debris. Now the goal is, okay, we need to efficiently and effectively transition this property to temporary public stewardship, right? Bring it into public control. And then let's think about a very deliberate, thoughtful way that we can move this property back out to the neighborhood, consistent with community priorities and in a more predictable fashion, working with responsible owners that are going to produce and turn that liability into an asset that contributes to the neighborhood's overall vision. That is one of the key roles of a land bank. I'm not going to go into too much depth in that. We've done plenty of sessions on land banks with Prosperity Indiana nationally. We have all those available. But that is a tool that allows a government to bring in that inventory. It basically is catching, again, my colleagues yell at me for saying this, but catching the wreckage of some of the weakest housing markets. But I think it's really important to explain it like that because that is what it is. We're having a real breakdown of the social economic factors that hold the neighborhood together. But it doesn't mean that it's trash. It means we can bring it in, we can repurpose it, and we can put those back out as assets. So on this slide, we jumped ahead. There's one that's where communities can actually change their laws at the state level. Many times the state laws play a large role in how well a community can utilize these two key systems to bring property under temporary stewardship and turn them back out to assets to the community through a land bank. Many states can even preempt some code enforcement solutions. The tax foreclosure system can be so antiquated and slow that it may take 4, 5, 6 years to get control of a property that's harming neighbors and neighborhoods, which is just
it's unacceptable. So we do work with many communities to change their state laws. And one of the really important tools that can be available through state laws is that you actually can place code liens. That is, if you go out and mow the lawn, the city does. Basically, we call it the fix it up, pay it up, give it up approach. And these are vacant and abandoned properties, not occupied. But if an owner, we cite the owner for high grass, trash, and debris. If they won't fix it up, then we're going to go and remove that immediately so it doesn't harm the neighboring neighborhoods. But then we're going to make you pay it up. The taxpayers just cleaned up your negligence, and we're going to make you pay it up. And if you don't pay it up, then we're going to attach it to your tax bill, and we can enforce it through a foreclosure if you don't pay it then. So that's that whole fix it up, give it up, pay it up approach that pay it up, give it up approach that we have actually used in many states to move properties that have been vacant and abandoned into temporary public stewardship in order to get them back out in the community that serves their needs. Now, click it one more time. Don't go to, because this is an important one. There are many states, including Indiana, that kind of disrupt this really important approach that we use in weak market systems. And that is right before you're about to pull that property into temporary public stewardship, you say, you know what? I'm just going to sell the debt to investors, to speculators, to outside owners. Or if it's not the debt itself, it's the property. Well, properties in weak markets often attract a very different kind of buyer. They're not ones that have a commitment to the long-term health and vitality of a neighborhood. And what you're doing, particularly when you're selling a tax lien, is you're basically relinquishing the most powerful power, the most significant power that a local government can bring to bear in this challenge, and that is the foreclosure. If somebody doesn't pay their taxes, you can foreclose, bring that property in-house. When you sell it to a tax lien investor, basically you've privatized collection and enforcement of delinquent taxes. One, you've put your residents, if there are occupied properties, in harm. It's unregulated, completely unregulated. You've now turned all of the collection over to maybe 1, 10, hundreds of different actors. Some of them can be foreign, out of state. They could be institutional investors that know how to game the system, that know how to extend this as much as possible so they can extract as much wealth from the residents. So we are not a big fan of selling tax liens. And in fact, when we design land bank legislation at the state, we even try to give the land bank particular power where it can jump ahead of any of the investors or speculators, whether it's tax liens or tax deeds sold. It really is about bringing that under public stewardship temporarily and getting way more predictable and deliberate outcomes that over a long term can help rebuild a market. But at the very least, it can minimize the harms to the neighbors and the neighborhoods in that market. Okay, next slide. I'm not seeing any chats. I'm not seeing any questions. So either I'm knocking it out of the park or half of you are asleep because the coffee wasn't strong enough. So feel free to chime in. Let me know that there's some folks out there with pulses, even if just to say hi. So here we get to the policy solution part. I thought it was really important to just talk about that weak market because we're going to come back to it with a strong market. It sets the stage for a lot of it. Thank you, Angela. Appreciate it. I put on the left here, let's keep in mind our key goals, right? And if we look, some of these are hard to see. Some folks may need to expand your slide, but I will read through them. I could obviously spend 45 minutes on each one of these solutions. So if anyone wants to reach out afterwards, feel free to do so. So for vacant properties and abandoned properties, right? Take that fix it up, pay it up, give it up approach. In Indiana, you also have the unsafe building law. I know many communities utilize that law, similar to kind of like condemnation, that is a tool used in other communities where the property is just unfit for human habitation or is an imminent threat to public risk. Usually does provide local governments additional powers to take action. 2, there has to be demolition of the worst. We are not advocates of mass scale demolition, but honestly, when you look at some of those numbers where the supply and the demand is so out of whack, there's just no question that demolition has to be part of your strategy. Obviously, try to preserve as much as you can, particularly those historically and culturally significant properties. But there's no question that demolition has to be a key. When it comes to some of the greatest challenges, we know in the weak markets that the homeownership rates are much lower. We know that the poverty rates are much higher. We know that there's a lot of landlords that, while they are well intentioned, just run into problems because of the finances. And we know there are some really bad landlords that take advantage and prey on some of our most vulnerable residents. One of the most important tools, policy tools, we believe, is really passing proactive rental inspections. Code enforcement is usually on the outside. It's picking up debris. It's boarding windows, right? But the real intent of code is also to protect the health and safety of all residents. And you can't do that unless you get inside. Fortunately, more and more communities are moving forward with proactive rental inspections programs. But I would just say that the design is so important. You really need to think about a carrot and stick mentality. Do not see this as a punitive approach towards all landlords. Landlords are a key partner in your housing justice portfolio, and find the ones, again, where you can reward responsible owners and responsible landlords. And there's a lot of great examples out there where that carrot and stick approach works very well. There is no question that if you move forward with a proactive rental inspection program, you are going to have to balance decency and displacement. There's no question. There are some that just like no residents, tenants can be displaced. Well, I've walked into many of these apartments in my hometown and other places. I'm sure you have too. And these conditions are completely unsafe and unhealthy for children, for tenants, for families. And there is a point where some of those units are going to be condemned because of the proactive rental inspection process. So before you get to that point, concurrently in developing and designing your proactive rental inspection program, you also design a well-resourced and just relocation program. It's not an if it happens, you do it at the front end if you want to make sure that this happens. You also provide additional supports to both tenants and landlords. There's some that do a landlord academy, so they get additional points if they go through the academy. Their units are inspected less frequently if they go through the academy, kind of an example of that carrot and stick approach. But I would also say that there are communities that use mediation process rather than, again, using everything in the courts. You know, enforcement is not always the answer. Many of these times is just as we've seen recently, questioning law enforcement and the need to think more holistically about what community safety really means. There are many occasions in which housing insecurity or housing challenges is born out of social crises, mental health issues, poverty, and enforcement itself and sending folks to the court is not the solution. So, I believe it was Baltimore moved forward with the mediation services. About 87% of the landlords took advantage of it, and 80% of the landlords and tenants resolved their cases. Incredible outcome. Tenants' right to counsel policy. You know, many tenants are scared to call code because they're afraid of retaliatory eviction. So ensuring that tenants have right to counsel, that they know their rights, is another very important strategy, both in weak markets and in strong. This idea, and I love this, it's just came back from an event that we had in Austin and Peoria, Illinois, where just some excellent leadership in the code department. They completely changed their approach to code encouragement, recognizing again that enforcement is not something that they want to do, it's only last resort. So they approach it literally as partners with communities. They drop off door handles. Nice job when they've actually complied with a violation. Really built some great relationships. So this idea also of the equitable off-ramp. Excuse me, I've been suffering from a cold the last couple. This is where there's going to be vulnerable homeowners that might get dinged by code violations. In Gary, Indiana, we saw that where of 100 violations that were sent out, only 6 of them were completed in the first 30 days. Once the 12 of the 100 figured out what the city was actually asking them to do, they then complied. And then the other 12 were brought to the court. This is like social work. This is folks that wanted to do the right things but didn't have the resources. So we're seeing more and more communities right now, particularly with the ARPA allocations, these unprecedented federal investments that communities have until 2026 to spend. They're tying a lot of their ARPA funds, or some of them, into a home repair program that is connected to those who are trapped in kind of their code cases and code enforcement. And I'm sure we're going to see some great examples of this in the coming years. Next, if you could click the button, please. Yes, the slide deck will definitely be made available. Free estate planning services for income or age qualified owners. Particularly down in the South, the challenge with heir properties is very real. But we see this also popping up in all the states and communities we work with. So heirs properties, there is no like silver bullet. It's just really difficult. The best thing to do then is to prevent it. And so we're seeing some communities that are working maybe with a law clinic at a law school that are providing free estate planning services to their residents. There's a CDC in Louisville that anytime it sells a property to affordable first-time home buyer, they require that the will be actually attached to the deed. This is just ways to prevent vacancy and abandonment in the future, and also to protect generational wealth. Tax breaks for some homeowners that will actually house low-income folks, right? As we know that if we look at the pro forma sheets, that the numbers won't work. Like this is government's role is how do we make it work for you? And this is going to be required in weak markets, and it just looks differently in the strong markets. But there's a great way to do that to expand housing opportunities in neighborhoods of opportunities for low income or Section 8 holders. Provide those folks a tax break. Equitable assessments, obviously affordable housing preservation and production. Folks think, and I've heard this too often, we have such a weak housing market, or there's no gentrification pressures. What do we have to worry about affordable housing for? And then 3 years later, the market it flips like a switch. And now they're stuck and they wish they could go back in a time machine and deal with the seed affordable housing as they were working on all of their other strategies to kind of jumpstart the market and minimize the harms. I just can't tell you how many times I've seen this. And when you think about it, the amount of money that public governments spend on affordable housing because they didn't do it when the market was soft is mind-blowing. And I'll give you an example of that when we switch. But do it when it's cheap. Don't concentrate affordable housing in just one neighborhood. Make sure that you seed it throughout wherever you have the chance. But don't pretend like you don't need to do it because there's still just a soft market. Big one is eliminating the sale of tax liens, ending tax auctions altogether, and utilizing land banks. In New York, Syracuse, and Albany have done just that. They have an excellent tax foreclosure process through the courts, judicial foreclosure process, ends up with clear title. And both of those governments have decided, you know what, we were ending up with speculators, the same slumlords that were causing problems for our code enforcement office in neighborhood C were coming to the auction to buy these properties for $10,000, $14,000. We're done. We're not going to feed you anymore. We're going to bring these properties in-house through a land bank, and they're going to work with the community. They're going to bring in additional dollars. They're going to subsidize equitable outcomes, and they're going to be an integral part of a long-term vision of turning this neighbor around and making it work for everybody. Okay, next slide. So feel free to jump in the chat. I'm going to ask a quick question. So here we have the housing building code enforcement systems, delinquent property tax enforcement systems. How do you think these change in strong markets? Like what's likely different? Does anyone want to throw a guess in the chat or the Q&A? I will say this, they work. You get compliance way more frequently. Why? Because the asset has value. Traditional code enforcement, where you ding them and you say you got 20% or 20 days to fix it, they almost always fix it, right? Traditional code enforcement works in strong markets. The other thing is that if you have a land bank, guess what? There's really nothing to catch because no property really ends up in the delinquent property tax enforcement system, at least all the way to the end. Now, sure, even in San Francisco and New York City, there are some properties that will go through all the way to the end, but very few. Why? Because the asset has incredible value. There's equity in that asset. And they'll sell it, or someone else will come and buy it, or they will pay off, find a way to pay off or bring their properties up to repair. So I just want to mention that these systems obviously play much less role in strong market systems, and the government's approach changes differently in how they even deploy these systems. Okay, next slide. Does that make sense? I hope so. Feel free to put a puzzle emoji if it didn't. Same goals as we wanted before. Traditional code enforcement usually works. Now, when we're looking at tenants and vulnerable tenants, now the displacement triggers are not unsafe, unhealthy rentals. It's not housing insecurity. It's not I was retaliated against for calling, right? They're all market pressures and extreme market pressures. And so the policy solutions are just entirely. Some communities have passed rent stabilization and control. New York City is probably some of the most famous. Let's control how much rent can be increased. Tenants' rights, there's much stronger investments in tenant organizing and advocacy in some of these stronger markets. And then where we've really only seen this work very well, which is in Washington, D.C., and even then it has its challenges, but there's a policy and a legislation called the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. Basically, if an owner puts a property up on the market, the tenants have 30, 45, 60 days to basically match any offer and then convert that into condominium and homeownership opportunity. You can't just pass this policy and expect it to work. You have to build all the supports, the technical assistance to the tenants, the funding available for quick access to capital. But certainly the DC has been able to turn probably hundreds of units that would have been lost to affordability into home ownership opportunities or long-term rental affordable opportunities through this process. But they paid so much for it. The amount of cost per unit is incredible. Whereas again, if you go back to the weak markets, where some communities like Indianapolis or Muncie and Evansville are using the land bank to produce affordable housing, basically they're just waiving a few $1,000s of taxes off and then creating an affordable housing unit. So much more cost effective and fiscally responsible. As soon as that market flips, everything changes. Obviously, preserve affordable housing. In this case, it's a little different. It's not necessarily those naturally occurring affordable housing units that you want to preserve, although those are present, maybe in some of those mixed markets or transitioning markets. But we see in many communities those LIHTC subsidies or any other kind of state or federal subsidies. When they expire, sometimes the owners are just ready to cash out and take advantage of the significant market appreciation. There needs to be a really strong effort to understand when those subsidies are expiring and then ensuring that you can continue those for another 20, 30, 40 years. Obviously, the production of affordable housing, right? This is a massive challenge right now under COVID, but it was a problem before. It's the supply. And how do we increase the opportunity of supply? Well, policy loosened the exclusionary zoning. Whenever we provide public investments into luxury rental properties, let's carve out 10, 20% must be for affordable families, 50%, 60%, 80%, and make that mandatory because our partners over at Grounded Solutions that works on these inclusionary housing policies, they will tell you voluntary inclusionary housing policies just do not work. Housing trust funds, we've seen these explode over the last 25 years, probably a few hundred now in the country. At the state level, at the county level, we have a federal housing trust fund as well, but also at the local level. And the variation among these is incredible, very flexible tool. We see more housing trust funds that are demanding that the anchor institution like the eds and the meds make a contribution, since they are also contributing sometimes to some of those market pressures that can change a weak market to a hot market. Transit-oriented development, obviously a really important policy when we're looking to expand affordable housing in the hot market. I'm going to quickly run through the second slide, or second column. Public land for public good. Even in Miami, where they have incredible housing affordability challenges, they did not understand how much land was held by public entities and agencies. When the U of M school actually mapped all of it out, went through all the records, they found that they had square footage almost equal to Manhattan in Miami. And it blew folks' minds, and it completely changed the conversation. So there's been this entire campaign around public land for the public good. Stop the crony deals that happen by commissioner in each of their districts, and take all of these assets that are owned by the public and ensure that they can be used for affordable housing. So anytime there is a strong market, the public entities should understand what their inventory is and turn those into affordable housing or other amenities that serve the public good. Community land trust, again, we're seeing those explode. Where it's great that we're also seeing many of them return to their roots with a strong focus on racial equity. Many Black-led community land trusts now being formed and organized, which is awesome. Now governments need to resource them, invest in Black excellence and ownership. Protect legacy residents from rising home values. This is a real challenge. In Louisville, there's concern over a massive and really excellent cross-sector initiative that's happening to the West End in Louisville, where Breonna Taylor was murdered. And many of them are recognizing that if their strategy works, many of the legacy residents that have endured the harms for decades are going to be kicked out and displaced involuntarily. There's going to be cultural displacement. And so they are thinking about this at the front end. Are there ways, and some communities have passed actually what's called almost legacy exemptions? If you've been in a neighborhood for 10 years or more, then basically your increase can be pegged to something much larger than what the market values are increasing, or it can be frozen altogether. It's these kind of very creative policy solutions, again, entirely different from what we've seen in the weak markets, but that are just as needed by the government if we truly want inclusive, equitable, and resilient communities. Couple last things. Whenever public housings are going through redevelopment projects, whether that's the RAD demonstration or the Hope Street, oftentimes it's said we're going to allow for residents' right of return, but it's not enshrined in any contracts. Mandate right of return for any redevelopment projects, public or low-income housing. And then your last resort is open market acquisition. You're going to have to bond for a lot. You're going to have to invest a lot. And that is your last tool. And I wanted to leave with that because, again, it just goes to show you when you have a pipeline of tax foreclosed vacant properties that are coming to your government every year, and you throw them out to the investors and the market, it just seems like a missed opportunity. I can't beat this enough, is that think about how you can use those and still partner with the private market. I'm not, I hope I'm not like turning them into villains. I'm just asking you, if you were to sell your house because you just got offered a great job somewhere else, out of state, would you auction it off at a Legion Hall or a conference center in a hotel and where you are on a Saturday at 10 o'clock, no matter who shows up? Or would you put it on MLS and be a bit more thoughtful about the disposition, right? Of course you do the latter. And that's my point on the tax foreclosure and the land bank. That's all it is. It's recognizing that land is one of the community's most valuable assets, second to its people, and that you need to be more thoughtful and predictable about how you use this incredible asset and when you have the opportunity to seize it, if you truly want to build equitable, inclusive, and resilient communities. Why don't we jump to the next slide? That is the end. But I did just want to come back to those 4 common challenges that we face, how important land is, and how we truly need to rethink government's approach to land, and to do it in partnership with residents, particularly those who are most impacted by vacancy and abandonment or the quickly accelerating market pressures. Thank you so much, and I hope you've all had a great day with Prosperity Indiana. The slide deck will definitely be available to folks, and I'm always willing, my team, to reach out and speak with folks, but I know that we're going to be in Indiana probably for a little longer. We got a lot of partners across the state, in the rural areas, in the urban areas, in the suburban areas, and we really want to make sure that the state provides you the best policy ecosystem for you to do the good work on behalf of your residents. Thank you.
Well, that's the problem, Tarek. You get involved with Indiana, it's not so easy to extricate yourself.
Well, as I told you, we don't like breakups, so we're not good with that. So it's like a match made in heaven here.
I have to say, my screen was taking up. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at what's in the Q&A, if that's already been addressed. I just want to encourage folks, if you have other questions, please do drop those in the Q&A.
We have 5 minutes. Very quickly, can a CDC organization organize land banks, or does it have to be a government entity? It doesn't have to be either, but it's just land banks really need to be created pursuant to state enabling legislation, because it's the state legislation that gives this entity particular powers to do the work that it's supposed to do in those weak markets, to acquire properties cost effectively and reliably, to be able to dispose of them flexibly, not based on price, but based on outcome, to do it transparently, accountably, in partnership with community, right? Like all of those are literally superpowers that are granted to this entity, and it has to be done through state legislation. In Virginia, they allow municipal governments to basically assign land bank functions to CDCs and nonprofits, or to create one. So the state legislation determines what entity can do it. But if you don't have the powers, then really you're just a nonprofit that's going to try to get in the space, and you won't have the impact that's needed. The second question is, what is the difference between housing trust funds, community land trust, and land banks? Well, that's a big one to unpack. Very quickly, housing trust funds is just that. It's usually created, let's say, at the local level, and it is an annual allocation of funds, whether it's general funds, whether it's a special tax. Usually there is through the creation of the fund, it defines where that the revenue is coming from. That then will be assigned and dedicated specifically to advance affordable housing or other housing justice goals in a community. And they're very flexible. I think there's a website, National Housing Trust Fund Project or something. They're incredible. And they have a whole book on case studies all over the country. Community land trusts are simply nonprofits. Consider them just another affordable housing provider, but they really focus on permanent affordable housing. They focus on community control and ownership. They actually emerged over 50 years ago as part of the civil rights movement. There were so many Black farmers down in the South that were being dispossessed of land. And so this actually, first one was in Albany, Georgia. And it really is about, how do we control these assets? And how do we, through a particular lease, ensure that they are affordable, not just today or for whoever's using it now, but for generations of families. And land banks are those governmental entities that are specifically designed, pursuant to state enabling legislation, to tackle vacant, abandoned, and tax foreclosed properties and return them to productive use consistent with community priorities. At our website, you can find a lot about land banks. We just published a small, maybe 20-pager, 30-pager on community land trust and land bank partnerships, how those two can work together. There's about 6 great models in the country. And then again, I definitely Google that housing trust fund, the National Housing Trust Fund Project. It's a wealth of resource information. Should this be by county or city? I assume you're talking about the land banks. It all depends. It needs to be tied to the tax foreclosure system, right? The 90% of all of the properties held by land banks across the country come through the tax foreclosure pipeline. So I can't emphasize enough how important this linkage is. Sometimes in some states, only the county is the foreclosing governmental unit. So land banks can only be created at the county. Here in Indiana, you have that choice. Mostly the county does the foreclosures, but I know Muncie has a local one. I know Evansville has a local one. They're looking to explore a regional land bank in the South Bend and Michiana area. So it really just depends on how it's linked to the tax foreclosure process in the state enabling legislation.
Well, Tarek, with that, we are just about at time. And actually, if folks hang on for just a sec, I nearly forgot, but I do have a quick session survey that I would be remiss to not share and get people's feedback real quick. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. And as we're finishing up, it's one other thing that I want to let people know, that there's ways to continue to engage with this work through Prosperity Indiana. And actually, we've been working. I've been kind of going back and forth with Tarek. He has been offering technical assistance to a group of land bank scholarship team partners through PI. And actually, we have a piece of legislation right now that looks like it's positioned now to hopefully pass at the State House, Senate Bill 292, that would help provide a list of eligible properties for land banks, and also would help create an optional process for the transfer of some of those properties. So really, perhaps the best benefit of that is to increase the visibility of land banks and to set up partnerships for some deeper recommendations that we've been looking at. So happy to continue the conversation on any of that. Tarek, any last words before we close out?
Y'all do really important work. Just keep doing it with passion and persistence. And thank you. Stay healthy and stay helpful.
Thanks again. Thanks, Tarek. And thanks, everybody. Please join us in a few minutes for our closing plenary and our networking session. So thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Take care.